Okay, everybody, you're in for a treat now. This is the last panel of the day. We're going to talk about politics in Latin America, and we're going to look ahead to 2016.
All good.
Feels to me like a medical convention up here because it's me and three doctors. Dr. Bruce Bagley, Dr. Ed Gamarra, and Dr. Susan Kaufman Purcell. And if you're interested in politics in Latin America, then you don't need any introduction to anyone up here except for me. But these three are like a dream team to talk about politics in Latin America. Bruce Bagley is everybody's favorite Latin American Studies professor at the University of Miami. Same goes for Ed Gamarra at FIU. And Susan, of course, is the brains behind, along with Susie Davis, of course, behind the Center for Hemispheric Policy. And it's a tremendous honor for me to turn the lights off. This is the last panel, and so no further ado, let's get at it. Let's talk about Venezuela. Obviously, that's the big story. And I don't expect anybody to forecast for 2016. I'd like them to forecast at the end of December because pretty much anything could happen, right? So, Susan, why don't you lead us off and tell us about what might or what could or what you think is likely to happen in Venezuela.
Well, I mentioned, thank you, Ian. I mentioned one of the issues earlier that I think we need to know a little bit more about what the military did and how it's broken into various camps in terms of tolerance or pushing for allowing or pushing Maduro to accept the results of the election. We do know that, at least what I've been reading, Diosdado Cabello was not too keen on it, and he wanted a kind
Diosdado Cabello, you want to?
Oh, I'm sorry. He's an ex-military.
You should know the rules of your own panel discussions.
Well, I'm relaxing now that I don't have to do it. So. But in any case, he's an ex-military guy, really close ties to the military. He's also probably a huge drug kingpin within the Venezuelan political elite, and he's currently head of the National Assembly. And so what he apparently, from what I've been reading and hearing, wanted was a hardline, response, and not let the opposition take the kinds of control that it's going to be able to take, in theory at least, over the National Assembly. And he apparently lost out that the military did not support him. He lost. So that's interesting. If that's true, that's very interesting, because it might also mean that the kind of shenanigans that we were discussing that Andres Oppenheimer wrote about last week, which would be a redo of what Maduro and Chavez did in the past, Chavez particularly, where if a opposition governor would win control of a state, all of a sudden they created a new level on top of him, which took away all the main powers of the governor and instead gave it to some allies of Chavez. So that's why this is difficult. Also, the economy, as we all know, we've heard it is a basket case. And they clearly have to put some reforms through in order to keep it from crashing even more. They'll be able probably to get a lot of it through the National Assembly, but there's going to be opposition. The people that voted, I just want one last thing to say about this. The people that voted, a lot. This was an election in which a lot of the poor people ended up shifting their votes in favor of the opposition. The poor people didn't want to vote for the opposition in the past because they at least knew that from the Chavistas they got some schools, they got some subsidies, they got some hospitals, etc. And the opposition was an unknown quality that was portrayed as capitalist. What happened next was you got to this point with the disintegrating economy where all of a sudden I think the poor people said, well, what more can we expect from this regime? We're losing every day. So in that sense, it was like a tipping point had been reached where they were ready to try something new because they saw the writing on the wall. I mean, maybe I'm giving them more credit, but that's how I see it.
And Ed, how do you see things playing out?
Well, before I begin, I want to thank you, Susan, for 10 wonderful years, and thank you for the privilege of being here at this closing session. I also want to thank you, Ian, for strategically positioning me right smack in the middle, which is where I want to be. between the left and the right.
And I'm on the
So-
right.
Depends how you look at this, I guess, but
No, it's
we
right,
all know.
he's on the left.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, no. I think it's important not to be too, or at least to be overexcited about what happened in Venezuela. And first and foremost, I think that it's important to understand the constitutional design of Venezuela. And most importantly, the fact that this is a presidential system, that despite the fact that there is a supermajority, presidential systems in Latin America still have an extraordinary amount of weight in the executive branch. And in particular in Venezuela, this is a system designed specifically to give the president extraordinary powers. And so I think, we need to really weigh what this means. I think you can look specifically at what a 3/5 majority means in Congress and the kinds of things that they can do. But we also need to understand that President Maduro can just about veto anything that comes out of the legislature, and that I think you're going to have to look at it on a project by project basis. I think there is a real understanding of the crisis. So let me say that as first and foremost. Secondly, I think it's also important to note that in this illiberal democracy of Venezuela, over the course of the last decade, they spent an awful lot of effort not only in controlling the legislature, which was key, but also in controlling other institutions. And so, for example, one of the key things they might attempt to do, the opposition, might be to change the composition of the electoral court, of the electoral tribunal, which has been very problematic and so on. But I think, again, to do that, not only are they going to need, they can overturn it, but they need the court system to really judge and pass, to really impeach the electoral tribunal. So again, I don't see much movement in that direction either. And Andres Oppenheimer is a very close, good friend of mine, but I've always been in disagreement with him, and I think it is really important to not go into the kind of oversimplistic understanding of what was going on in Venezuela. I know just from my own research that the government of Venezuela had data that really made it very clear to them that they were going to lose. And they had this information a long time ago, and they've been preparing themselves for this. And part of that was, I think why I wasn't as surprised on Sunday when the results came out. They were prepared for this, and now the real question and the real interrogante in Spanish is what they're going to do in this new scenario.
Bruce, what are they going to do in this new scenario?
Well, I think I want to emphasize 3 points here. First of all, one of the reasons that the Maduro government and the Chavista movement lost so badly, and it was entirely predictable.
Get closer to your mic, Bruce.
And it was entirely predictable that they were going to lose. One of the reasons they lost so badly was that the economy has bottomed out here. Or perhaps not bottomed out, but it's in disastrous condition, which means that the new government is going to have to govern with a disastrous economy as well. And I think most people sort of ignore that. The possibilities of social discontent rising rather than falling are very great in the immediate months to come, especially, second point, if the new government attempts to dismantle the social programs that have been put in place by Chavismo. One thing is the corruption, crime, malfeasance. Another thing is to take away benefits that have been given, right, to a population over a period of almost 17 years. It's going to be very difficult to do that. So I think that there's a great deal of a great deal of illusions that are affecting the people's estimations of the pace of change in Venezuela, not only because of the presidential system, with which I agree. A second basic point is that the opposition is divided, right? It has a supermajority, but that should not lead you to the conclusion that all of the multiple parties in Venezuela are going to agree, right, on every major new initiative that is put forward. Many of them are seeking to run for president in the future. They are going to try to carve out their own career paths towards that presidency, and they are not going to subordinate themselves to the leadership of any of these groups. So holding together the opposition coalition is going to be extremely difficult, and I think that you are going to see the Maduro government and Diosdado Cabello attempt to undermine, right, that unity within the coalition that could give them an effective supermajority in a number of areas, right? And then finally, I think that one should anticipate as conditions get worse before they get better. And as there are efforts to dismantle some of the overweening social programs, some of the clearly unproductive social programs that have been adopted that are riddled with corruption, that there is going to be social protest in the streets, probably orchestrated by Chavismo. They certainly will not abandon all of that, and that governance moving forward, not just through December, but through 2016, is going to be extremely problematic in this situation.
You think they'll pass a law to release Leopoldo Lopez?
I
The
think,
opposition leaders in jail?
yeah, I think there's going to be a massive, effort to get Leopoldo out of jail. Whether or not the president will go along with that or will resist becomes an open question. But at this point, Leopoldo is no longer the threat that he was.
There's a lot of Venezuelans in the crowd, so I suspect we're going to have some more questions on Venezuela. Let me open it up a little bit and talk about the larger narrative, which was already part of every story now in Venezuela, which is, first of all, we had the opening in Cuba. Then we had the surprise victory of Mauricio Macri in Argentina, and now this overwhelming defeat of Chavismo in Venezuela. So the larger narrative is this is the demise of the ALBA alliance, the ALBA countries. Now, we don't talk about the other ones, so let's talk about those. Is Bolivia about to go down? Is Ecuador about to go down? And Nicaragua? Those are the other three members. Is this a sweeping change in the ALBA countries and left-wing populism in general in Latin America?
I've read a lot of these articles about, the red tide is ebbing, or pink tide, they're calling it, I guess, is ebbing in Latin America, which makes it sound like this is a super ideological development and that the people are voting ideologically. I don't think so. I think that people are voting against a failed government, and they're voting in favor of something different in the hope that it might work. I do not think that all of a sudden all the left-wing populists and people who are willing to vote for them in the population suddenly became great free marketeers, because they aren't. And Latin America has a whole political history. It's sort of what we used to call the Latin America domino theory, or else the contagion theory. The idea was that when one started falling in a different direction, look at South America in the 90s, where all of a sudden they were privatizing, they were all market-oriented, the dollar, blah, blah, blah. And then they started going left when the commodity prices started going up, or even before that. So it wasn't ideological. Latin America, the old swings used to be a little different in that they usually involved a military coup. So that you had there was a civilian government, and then there was a military, and then there was a civilian, for the same reason. It's not that all of a sudden everyone permanently became anti-military. It was that the military were failing, so they went and tried some kind of more civilian thing, and then when the civilians failed, they went back. I think that cycle is still operating, and that is precisely because of the end of the Chinese bubble, the crash of commodity prices, and particularly oil, and because of the nature of what South America produces, that they were all not all, but many, more willing to try something else. If it turns out that the next 5 years or so doesn't seem to bring any kind of improvement in people's lives or a solution to some of the problems, you're going to see rumblings again, I think. On the other hand, it's very hard, as I've said many times, that to have populism, especially left-wing social spending populism, without money.
Eduardo Gamarra is a native Bolivian. Eduardo, are we seeing the end of Evo Morales too, or not?
Well, I agree with Susan generally. I think people are tired of mismanagement and poor governments and so on and so forth. But the striking thing is, and those of you who know me know that Evo is no santo de mi devoción, right? But especially you, Bruce, right?
I know.
But, you know, the reality is that Evo hasn't done a bad job at governing Bolivia. And they have done, in fact, a fairly good job. And this is, I think it kind of, again, leads to when you oversimplify the analysis of a country, right? And you kind of just classify it as a populist, leftist, pinko kind of government, right? Then you miss really the nuances. And for example, one of the most important nuances, both in Bolivia and I think in Ecuador to a certain extent, is that they use the rhetoric of the left extraordinarily well. But Evo Morales, in essence, what he did is he governed really from an old-fashioned state capitalist perspective. He changed the terms of the contracts and called it nationalization and made a very, very big stink. Got the Brazilians all mad by putting the military out in front, but in fact didn't really nationalize, right? There is a great presence of foreign corporations, especially in the hydrocarbon sector. So I think it's important to understand that. Now, the problem with Evo is that, and here I'll say another controversy, not only about Bolivia, but I think in general. We have spent a lot of time, those of us who study the transition to democracy, in assuming that Latin Americans are really moving toward democracy and that democracy, liberal democracy, was our first option and that we were all committed liberal Democrats. When in fact, you know, I think most of the literature tells us and most of the public opinion tells us that we are really mainly largely committed illiberal Democrats. We like having an Evo in control. We like control of the media. We like a whole bunch of these things that, you know, that I certainly don't like, but with which we have been extraordinarily satisfied with. And I think it's demonstrated by the fact that we keep voting these people in. And, you know, fraud notwithstanding, I don't think they need fraud. They get reelected. Because on the one hand, I think most people agree with these ideas that we shouldn't give the media too much power to say things. The opposition, you know, we are much more comfortable, frankly, with a single party within multiplicity of parties. And so I have a, you know, my students don't like it when I say this, but I do think that our first choice has never been liberal democracy in the region. And that we have been really comfortable with these individuals, especially when they perform well. The problem is when they perform poorly, and that's when the cycle comes in. And so I think, you know, for example, Evo has basically is trying now to, you know, he just got reelected. He had Congress approve a law, and there's a referendum in February. Now, here's where I think it's interesting, and it is tied to the commodities, and it is tied to, Bolivia will have 5% growth this year, but the projection is that this is going to begin to decline significantly over the next few years. But the last poll that I saw has 52% of Bolivians rejecting Evo's referendum. And so, you know, 52 to 40% favoring his reelection. So I think, you know, maybe the tide is turning, but I think there's also this sense that, you know, he will have been in for a long, long time. He's already the longest serving president in Bolivian history. So I think, you know, there may be a tide changing here, but not necessarily for the reasons we suspect.
And I agree with Eduardo. I think you have to analyze the ALBA countries one by one. Evo has done reasonably well, but el poder corrompe, right? And absolute power, you know, corrupts, absolutely. Evo's been in for a long time. There are grietas beginning to appear, right, in the government. His popularity may well not last, particularly in the context of a downturn. But to date, he is nothing like the Maduro government, which had neither the charisma of Chavez, right, or the smarts, right, of a number of leaders within the ALBA context. So Maduro is probably the lower end of the ALBA countries. Complete incompetence and stubbornness in the face of obvious need for change. Evo has been far more pragmatic. In the middle, you find several others. The Cubans, recognizing that Venezuela is no longer the staunch pillar, right, that they can rely on, have moved to open to the United States. That's quite pragmatic. The Cubans, right, important members of ALBA, are going to, between the Communist Party and the military, continue to rule Cuba for the foreseeable future, no matter what, you know, our fellow Cuban Floridians, you know, think about about the rapidity of change, and no matter what a number of young people in Cuba might like. Daniel Ortega is at the lower end. His growing corruption is a serious problem, but as an important member of ALBA, he's at least won the right to become Presidente Vitalicio if he keeps getting reelected. In the midst of all of this, Correa is proving to be fairly intelligent. He was buoyed by the commodity boom, but in the contest of Ecuador, his tax on inheritance and his tax on value added, or the import tax, he has become incredibly unpopular. I was in Ecuador several times over the summer and the early fall, encountered various demonstrations right in the streets of Quito and Guayaquil against him. He's not going to run for president. He is going to sit out in the hopes that the next government will not be able to govern. Very much, as I fear may occur in Venezuela, and that he will then return triumphant, remembering the great old days. So ALBA, as an alliance, is dissolving. Its challenge, right, to other forms of organization, integration in Latin America has faded virtually completely. It certainly is not a challenge to United States hegemony in the region, but individual ALBA countries are going to survive with their current leaders in place. Two other very quick points. The pink tide was in large part a response to the previous malfeasance and corruption of other governments. In Venezuela, the Adecos and the Copellanos, right, are clear examples. Daniel Ortega was out of power for 17 years and got reelected. People seem to forget these kinds of things in Latin America. So the previous governments did not demonstrate themselves to be either honest, filled with integrity, or competent. That same set of problems is going to occur, and now without the additional positive element of a buoyant, commodity-driven economy. So it's going to be tough times governing in a number of these places. That means that the pink tide was oversold. It was never a turn that far to the left, and I don't think that we are seeing a massive turn to the right. But I agree with both Susan and with Eduardo. Integrity in government, honesty, efficiency, right? Lack of corruption, and by the way, not permitting organized crime, right, to dominate your country, or your murder rate to go up as it has in Caracas. All of those kinds of things become fundamentally important. If the next governments are not able to demonstrate the capacity to govern, you are going to see yet another change in a shortened cycle.
In this context of shifting tides, can we address the U.S.-Latin America relations? Cuba has opened up the United States. Mauricio Macri could make some drastic changes in foreign policy in Argentina, rejecting Chavez, opening up more to the United States. How do you see things unfolding? And we don't have to necessarily go in order. Bruce, why don't you start? Talk about U.S.-Latin American relations, how they're going to change over the next 12 months.
Let me make three quick points. First, it's obvious that a number of these governments are going to be much more pro-United States than we have seen in the past, right? As both ALBA fades and as Cristina, right, exits stage right or whatever. So there's going to be a more positive environment towards the United States, particularly in the context of the downturn that we have seen. Which means somewhat ebbing affluence coming from China and from other parts of the world, so the United States becomes even more important. That's the first point. Second point, the United States no longer has a Latin American policy. It has not had one for a very long time, and in my opinion, should not. There is not a single Latin America. Never has been, right? The Brazilians talk only about South America. Right? As we heard on the previous panels, Mexico, Central America, and parts of the Caribbean are going to do much better, right, than other parts of South America, in part because they were cursed with not having any petroleum. Now they are blessed, right, by lower petroleum prices. So lumping all of Latin America together is not the way that the United States has been going with regard to its policies. And what we are seeing is a growing prioritization by the United States of the most important relationships between the United States and various countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. Most particularly Mexico, of course, is a priority because of its proximity and its importance as a trading partner, plus drugs and the border and all the rest of it. Brazil, right, good or bad, is the largest country in all of Latin America, 200 million people. It is going to continue to be a priority for the United States. Colombia and Chile, for a variety of reasons I don't have time to get into, are also going to be priorities. But, Honduras is not a priority. except, when it's sending large numbers of people to the northern border of Mexico or the southern border of the United States. Paraguay is not a real priority. Haiti is not a priority. To think that you can talk about Mexico and Brazil, right, in the same breath that you talk about these other smaller, less relevant, less important countries is simply wrong. And the United States is now developing bilateral relationships. That's what Gilma's trip to Washington was all about. She finally came around after, right, the Snowden revelations and all the rest of that, to make a state visit to the United States. The reason she did it is because she needs the United States as a trading partner. The United States desperately wants Brazil as an important trading partner in the region. If you think about it in that context, then the result is going to be that some parts of Latin America are going to continue to complain that the United States does not pay enough attention to them. But that's going to be the reality. The United States is going to pay attention to Central America, not because it's an important market, but because it's an important source of instability, drug trafficking, and organized crime. Colombia, right, is a model. Some people say for export, it's going to remain important for the United States. The economics, right, of the situation, trade, investment, and other things mean that Brazil and Mexico are going to be really important to the United States. Cuba was important in order to remove the thorn from the United States' paw. Now the United States is freer to develop a relationship with various Latin American countries that are of high priority on our foreign policy agenda, but it's not going to be all of them.
Susan.
Well, I basically agree with just about all of what Bruce said. I just want to add a few things. I'm not sure that the relationship with Cuba changed to mainly remove a thorn. I think there was another reason. I mean, I don't mean it wasn't the reason. That was one reason. I think another reason was that there was a fear that the declining Cuban economy would unleash another Mariel sort of thing. In other words, more migration. And I also think that it's interesting, Bruce said, well, Honduras is small, et cetera. This reminds me during the Central American Civil Wars, or whatever you want to call them, of the 80s, where journalists used to call me up and say, why are we giving so much importance to such small countries like El Salvador, et cetera? And he said, why are you saying to me, why? So I said, look, it's not a matter of size. We're in the Cold War, and countries of any size, big or small, sort of like with terrorism now. If the terrorists go to a small country, the small country that's hosting them suddenly becomes important. So I don't think we should judge the importance of countries in the region by their size. You can either they're important either for positive reasons. They have lots of opportunities for investment and trade, or they're important for negative reasons. They're unstable. They run the potential of becoming failed states. They run the potential of sending, thousands upon thousands, and maybe even in some cases a million, refugees, et cetera. Our own domestic, hemispheric refugee crisis. And so that's what it is. And I really think that, that U.S.-Latin American relations then will ebb and flow depending on either opportunities or potential challenges to the region. Now, the reason Bruce mentioned, Dilma, even before the Macri election, was starting to shift gears because they had been operating under this false paradigm. They thought that, the rise of China, the decline of the United States and the advanced countries, the endlessness of the commodities boom, they thought we were in a, quote, new paradigm, et cetera. Well, that paradigm lasted about 8 years. And now it's all quite different. So it doesn't mean that the developed countries are going to be top dog or the United States will be for endless periods either, but things ebb and flow in terms of the geopolitical realities and the rise and fall of certain regions or countries or whatever.
Delighted you used that word, paradigm. You can't have a discussion with three political scientists without using that word at least once. Ed.
Yeah, just so that I don't pile on, I think it's very, very important to understand the impact of the current U.S. elections on really the making of foreign policy anywhere, and certainly on Latin America. And when historically, and when we used to have these conversations in Miami in the late 90s, for example, it was amazing how many people in Latin America really liked the Republicans, right? And they really wanted the Republicans to win because free trade was the norm and so on. And that kind of changed, and in a sense, you know, the ALBA people were kind of happy when President Obama won in 2008, and you know, after all, as Evo said, you know, he's like, you know, he's one of us, right? But I think, you know, for the most part, Latin America really has never understood how American foreign policy is made, and I think that both of your descriptions and analysis of how American policy is made is important. But I do think we need to look at a couple of things. One is that Latin America doesn't really matter in Washington. And I think that's the most important thing. Notwithstanding the differentiations that you've made, you know, that Mexico is more important than a Bolivia or a Honduras in the grand scheme of things. But the reality is that given the world layout today, and really probably for most of Latin America's history, we really have not been important. And we think of ourselves as extraordinarily important, but we aren't important in the
You're speaking as
Latin American, yeah, as a Latin American. I'm a Bolivian, remember? So you know, we have never really matched, you know, the level of importance. I think, and at one point, you know, we were like number 27 or 28 on the White House list of priorities, for example. Now, I do, however, have one interesting disagreement, and I think, you know, for the president, I think Cuba is a priority. And I think Cuba is a priority, but not because it's important in terms of the grand scheme of the U.S. or anything else, but because this is a legacy issue for President Obama.
Yeah.
And so, you know, being a legacy issue, he's going to make sure that he advances as far as possible on a large number of issues that he can't get through Congress. And so, barring that, I think, you know, it's interesting, and I'll end with this very, very quickly. You know, the U.S. doesn't have an ambassador in La Paz or in Caracas, right?
Or in Mexico.
Or in Mexico, right? But Mexico's a different issue. But the reality is that you know, when you go to Washington, I've been asked on a number of occasions to go up and talk about Bolivia and say, you know, why should the U.S. have an ambassador or not? And when I left, you know, the conclusion by American analysts in Washington was very simple. This is not about, it is, you know, we prefer a bilateral approach, but the reality is, you know, from the perspective of Washington, it's better to have an ambassador than to not have an ambassador. That is our policy. We don't really care anymore about the substance, about whether they're leftist, whether they're pinkish, whether whatever. We care more about, you know, having a presence and moving through, you know, basically the bureaucratic kind of relations that we are better at doing, frankly. Okay, so I'll leave it there.
I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll open it up. But my question's about political accountability and rule of law, and it's about. And it has to do with Brazil. And so Dilma's facing potential impeachment. Now, this has happened before. I was a journalist in Brazil many years ago when Fernando Collor de Mello was impeached by the Congress, and then he quit before he could be actually officially removed from office. So then he came to Key Biscayne for a couple of years, chilled out, went back to Brazil, to his state of Alagoas, and today is a sitting senator in Brazil.
And he's still corrupt, probably.
Well, yeah, but there's journalists here. I'm not going to say that. But this time around, it's different, right? Things are really different this time. First of all, I'd like to know whether you think Dilma is going to be impeached. And second of all, what the whole process means for accountability. Now, you know, in Brazil, we've seen these very aggressive prosecutors take issue and actually put people in jail, including
Government and private sector.
the PT guy who's Giseo is in jail. They've now put in jail some of the iconic business leaders in that country. So how did this happen? Is this important for all of Latin America, or is it just a peculiar set of events that's happening in Brazil and won't be repeated again? Ed, why don't you start?
Well, you know, I think, again, one of the most important things to understand about Brazil, and I'm not a Brazil specialist, but if you look at Brazil comparatively in the region, it has one of the strongest institutional settings in the region. And, you know, you can even go back as far as the impeachment of Collor de Mello and understand that, you know, that the political class there has not been averse at really taking on its leadership. And so I think it really is, it is significant what is happening in Brazil. I don't, I'm not going to predict President Dilma's demise or impeachment, but the reality is that she is in political trouble, and as we know from the letter from her vice president just in the last few days, things aren't well even with her ruling coalition. So she doesn't have the kind of political strength that might sustain her through an impeachment process. But I think more than anything else, what it does show is that at least in Brazil, they are putting in prison some very, very significant people. Mm-hmm. That is not the case in the rest of the region. And if you look, for example, at what happened in Guatemala, I think in Guatemala, what happened there was largely an extraneous affair, not necessarily a national affair, notwithstanding the importance of civil society. The role of the U.S., the role of Colombians, and the role of the UN was very important in getting through that. Look at TI's index this morning. It's corruption index. They're putting a man like Bautista in the Dominican Republic as kind of the face of the most corrupt person in the world. Is now a Dominican, right?
Really?
So corruption is doing very well, thank you, in most of Latin America, because it's not really that important. Okay, it really is not that important. I mean, when you look at most public opinion polls, it's security first, the economy second, and corruption is a very distant third. Corruption becomes important when the economy is doing very, very poorly.
Susan.
Yeah, well, first of all, I read a really interesting article the other day in the Wall Street Journal, which had in its title something like, "Corruption is not the cause of the problems in developing countries. It is a symptom, really, of weak institutions, and especially politically weak institutions," which I agree with. Now, the interesting thing about the Brazilian situation is, now I don't know all the facts about it, but my sense of what I've read is that this occurred in a state. It was a small group of justices, most of whom had studied abroad. I think many in the United States. I don't fully understand how come they got as far as they did in getting these political leaders and also business leaders into jail. A good friend of mine who's a big Brazil specialist is very cynical, and he says, let's see how long they stay in jail, and if they ever get, what's the word you want? Sentence, et cetera. But I do think at least the first part of what's happening is kind of interesting, and whether or not it is transferable or repeatable in other countries, I don't know. But it's not coming out of the institutions per se as they always function. This seems to be a new kind of group that maybe can be replicated in other states. I also...
You don't think it has anything to do with like the Arab Spring kind of...
The Arab Spring was not a spring.
Yeah, but the way things change so quickly because of social media, you don't think social media in a country like Brazil, which is the #2 Twitter user in the world, has a huge impact? Because
I think that the new media is very important. It actually works on both sides. I mean, it could help another spring, Latin Spring or whatever, but it also can help autocrats very easily also. But you had the combination of the failing economy, which produces a zero-sum game, and so it increases conflict in a society. And you also had the growing middle class, although a lot of them are the newest arrivals in it are starting to sink out of it now, fall out of it now as the economy keeps declining. I think that those were the things that mainly affected it. Now, if what happens when the economy is better is not that corruption is reduced. In fact, especially in Latin America, which has in general a really large role of the state in the economy. That's a more traditional thing than, say, in the United States, and certain anti-capitalist sentiments for historic reasons, etc. That actually corruption increases when the state increases. And I remember one time when I was doing research in Latin America, I was doing my PhD research in Mexico, and I spoke to some rather interesting people, and I said, how do you explain corruption, and how important is corruption? This was under the old PRI and quite a few decades ago. And the guy said, well, he says, corruption's always there, he says, but corruption, you can think of it as corruption is almost a fixed percentage of what there is to steal. So what that means is that during good times, the country looks much more corrupt because there's much more to steal, like during a commodities boom. And then when things get a little, damped down economically, then the amount of corruption possible is reduced. Everybody you're seeing who's being put in jail or whatever, leaving their positions now, their corruption was from the heyday of the commodities boom.
Bruce?
Susan's comments remind me of a famous quote from Boss Tweed, right? Who said, I make an important distinction between honest and dishonest graft. In some senses, there's honest and dishonest graft in Latin America. I have a slightly different take on this. Quickly, I don't think Dilma is going to be impeached. I don't think the politics are going to permit it. So although this is going to prolong the agony, this process, and make her less effective as president than she has been, and that's saying a lot, I don't think that she's going to have to leave office. I think that Petrobras has been significantly damaged, and that this will affect, right, both its internal functioning and its creditworthiness abroad in the context of an economic downturn. So it's going to have long-lasting institutional implications within one of the sectors of Brazil that made it one of the shining lights, right, on the global scene. Petrobras was supposed to be one of the more professional and more effective and efficient institutions. It turns out that was a very false image.
No, but it was because of the increased role of the state in the whole process. When you suddenly had to buy put a certain amount of local content in drills and ships, etc.
Sure,
Under
and
Cardoso,
they did shift it, yeah.
you left a much less corrupt institution.
And it was adapting, right, to a series of shifts that were taking place, growing possibilities for state capturing rents, right, from the petroleum sector, all of that, I agree. But Petrobras has been significantly damaged. I have
agree with that.
a couple of other major points. I think that although Eduardo is correct that in opinion polls, corruption is not all that significant. People are concerned with security, citizen security in particular, with having a job and the prosperity of their economy, that corruption only comes down the line much farther, that it matters for Latin America. As Susan mentioned the concept of institutional weakness, I think that we have seen significant macroeconomic reforms over the last decade plus. We saw very few microeconomic reforms. It's one of the serious problems that Latin America has in the aftermath with the hangover, right, of the collapse of the commodity boom. And I think that they systematically failed throughout the region from Mexico to Patagonia to undertake the necessary institutional reforms. Part of that is corruption, cronyism, patrimonialism, and that it has a massive impact on the efficiency of government and on a concept that Ian raised, which is competitiveness of Latin America. In a variety of countries, campaigns are financed through licitaciones, in which you get 20 or 30% of the contracts coming into your party or your campaign coffers, which means that the obras, right, to Buenaventura in Colombia or to the Pacific coast in various places in Latin America simply don't get built. If you think about it that way, then one of the real tragedies of the commodity boom that has come and gone is the failure to complete these institutional reforms that are so fundamental to the future of good governance, the rule of law, and of competitiveness in Latin America. I don't think that we're going to see anything like the reforms necessary until there is a sustained growth in the middle class, a middle class that is able to demand fundamental changes in the forms of patrimonial and clientelistic rule that still dominate most of the institutions in the countries that we study.